Welcome to Wiley Writers Presents, a discussion about horror and how
Cats always interrupt Zoom calls.
cats always interrupt Zoom calls because they are evil.
That seems like a good topic.
I
What is the
agree.
topic?
Let's change it to that. No. So the topic is, can horror save the world? And we're going to be discussing that tonight and find out if there are ways that horror writers can positively influence the world around them, society, other people, their, values, morals, how people interact with the world around them. So my co-discussers tonight are Lee Murray, E.S. McGill, Eunice, and Alan Baxter. And I am Angel Lee McCoy. I am the lead person at Wiley Writers. We are a group of writers who support each other, who get together and do cross-promotion and read each other's work and just generally support each other. We're friends and we work together. You can find us at wileywriters.net. We are doing this panel for Stokercon, and so thank you very much to James Chambers and to Brian Matthews for putting the convention together. It's the Horror Writers Association is a wonderful organization for horror writers, and we are all members and love it, right?
Right.
So I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves. Lee, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lee Murray. I'm an award-winning writer from Aotearoa, New Zealand, coming to you from the future, in the past and the future. I write a little bit of everything, thriller, horror for middle grade and YA, and a bit of poetry. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here with my Wiley Writers friends. So thank you for inviting me.
Yay. Eunice, you want to go next?
Hi there, I'm Eunice McGill. I write as E.S. McGill. I am both an editor and a writer. Co-edited an anthology with Angel called Deep Cuts. Done a bunch of other stories. I live in Arizona right now, so if that shocks some of you, sorry. I'm a longtime Californian and moved out here. And I just retired last June from 20 plus years of teaching middle school English. So now I'm a full-time writer.
All right. Alan, your turn.
Hi, I'm Alan Baxter. I'm the Australian contingent of this one. British born, but been Australian for half my life. I write horror and often mixed with crime, mystery, noir, that sort of stuff. A lot of cosmic horror, creature features and all that kind of jazz.
All right. I'm Angel Lee McCoy. I'm a novelist. I spent most of my career writing for video games, and in 2017, I switched careers over to writing novels. I have 3 novels out so far, working on a 4th, and the very first book is called Stalking the Moon in the Weirdwood Welcome series. So that's me. Okay, so we're talking about, can horror save the world? The first question that I put together for this, did you have something you wanted to say?
I just said yes.
Yes.
I mean, I know I'm going to discuss it in greater detail, but just...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, it can.
Yeah, it's a good question because it's not a rhetorical question. We all agree, right? It could save the world. It can save the world, used properly. Stir.
If used properly, yes. Or, if used at all. How about this? So do you guys think that dark fiction affects social norms for the positive or the negative? And basically, if so, how? And do you have any examples of horror fiction that has had an effect socially, has had an effect on social norms?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes,
Go ahead,
absolutely.
Lee.
Oh, come on.
I think
Nobody lived through the 70s and, heard that music and didn't go and wanted to jump in the water, right? So that straight away you have something really effective that makes us think twice about going in the water. So therefore it is affecting our social behavior. So I think that, that's a brilliant example. I think about something like A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which was published in just before Christmas, I think, in 43. And Charles Dickens at the time, he was really struggling financially because his last book hadn't been picked up, so he really needed to write something universal. And he'd recently been to the sort of London orphanages, the poorhouses, and seen the kids suffering there, and he was struggling financially himself, and he could see that was something that might happen. So he wrote this text, which is a horror text, right? It's a horror ghost story that has been in print ever since, and we take that moral, don't we? We take that moral on of thinking about the less privileged people at in times when we come together, and I think that's had a huge impact on the world. So
one of the most persistent moral stories of I was going to say in our time, but obviously since before, of all time. There's not been a time when that story hasn't been told, I don't think, since it was written.
I don't think so either. It's not been out of print. And so I think that's a really good example of how fiction moves us and horror moves us in a way that it's been a play, it's been a movie, it's been a book, it's been poems have been done on it. It's really an effective piece, and that stood the test of time. So it's not just in this moment, it's going over time. So I think that's a sound. That's my example. There you go. I have more, but that's my starter for 10.
One of the great things about horror is that it doesn't shy away from issues. It dives into some topics that other genres they just will not touch. And a story that comes to mind is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Really highlights at a time when women were just considered hysterical, but it really highlights mental issues. And we were just reading Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indian, and what a fabulous horror novel to understand that culture. I mean, I think that's the first time I have ever seen that culture accurately portrayed. And then I don't know if you guys get it, but we have a show, it's on Hulu, it's called Reservation Dogs. And then after reading Graham's book and then seeing, that horror world, reflected in the real world, it was a beautiful experience. So we get a lot of great issues with horror. And I want to bring up one other story that always brings me to tears, talking about issues. It's the story Born of Man and Woman by Richard Matheson. And you first read that story and you're thinking, oh, that's a monster. It's a creature. Yuck. And then after a while, you're in tears because you realize it's a child. And it brings up that issue of, what's a monster? How do we treat people? And when we treat people a certain way, they become monsters because, he's out for revenge at the end. So horror takes us in all those different directions.
A good segue, because Richard Matheson and I Am Legend, one of the greatest books ever, I think. It's one of my all-time favorites. And that's really amazing exploration told from a point of view. It's a very old book, so I can probably get away with spoilers at this point. But the fact that it's called I Am Legend, the whole point of that book, when it turns out that the perspective has been asked backwards the whole way through, and you realize who the monster is and what's going on. It's a brilliant lesson in perspective and who's a bad guy and whatever. I've always maintained that when people say, why do you write horror? It's because it's honest. It's a genre of honesty. It doesn't shy away from the truth. So much storytelling is based on the idea of resolution and happy endings and heroes winning and whatever, which is great. We need that storytelling. We learn from stories in so many different ways. And there's that G.K. Chesterton quote, That we tell stories about dragons not so that we believe in dragons. We know there are dragons. We tell those stories so we know the dragons can be beaten, which is true. It's that exploration. But horror takes it a step further and goes where, but you know what? Sometimes the dragons win, or sometimes even though you beat the dragon, it's at massive personal cost or societal cost. And horror is honest like that. And those stories they make us face up to that. So, and by reading those stories, we prepare ourselves for the harsh reality of actual life, where there isn't always happy endings, where there isn't always resolutions. There was a study done that found that people who watch and read a lot of horror respond far better to traumatic situations and sudden decision making needs in emergencies, because we've watched all this stuff and sat back and gone, oh Christ, how would I deal with that? And then when presented with a real horror, there's this kind of subconscious training that's happened in a way, because we don't spend all our time going, everything will be all right, the good guys will win, there'll be a happy ending. We read horror and we're like, well, not always. So how do you deal, you know?
Yeah.
Because that's the way our brains are trained. Unfortunately, when you do research into the brain, you learn that the brain is more focused on fear than it is on good. And that makes sense, because if you're just walking around like a Pollyanna all the time, like everything's good, you know, you weren't going to survive. So horror brings that punch to it. It brings that fear, and it really sticks with you. And that's learning. That's a learning experience right there. And that's how it can affect social norms.
That's an interesting crossover as well there, in terms of what we cover in martial arts and stuff like that as well. Because a lot of the time when people are out in the street and in dangerous situations, you often find that people who are better trained and more able to defend themselves have to do that far less frequently, because they're in a state of mind where they're aware of where trouble comes from, and they're also in a state of mind where they're in a position to say, if trouble comes, I can deal with it. Whereas the people who don't expect trouble, or who go around fearfully all the time expecting to get hurt, if you like, or expecting to get jumped, are more likely to, because the sort of people who are going to cause trouble, they're not out there looking for a fight or looking for a challenge. They're looking for somebody to beat up. They're looking for someone to make themselves feel better. That's the monster in them. So they're not going to look at someone who looks like they can handle themselves and go, I'll test myself against that person. They're going to look for the person who's kind of cowed and fearful and small, you know, be it physically or psychologically, and attack that person to make themselves feel better. They don't want to fight. They want to beat someone up. And so there's that idea that the more aware you are and the more you carry yourself with awareness, the less things are going to surprise you. And that feeds into what we're saying, I think, about horror. The more aware you are of what possibilities are out there beyond happy clappy, everyone's going to be fine, then hopefully the better prepared we are. So that changes society.
Well, it's not just individuals though either, is it? Because if you think about, I mean, I just think about all the pandemic fiction, you know, I mean, you know, zombie fiction is pandemic fiction, you know, we've been saying that forever, you know, and if you'd read any, then you would know that there would be people that break the, you know, that aren't going to go into lockdown, and there are people that, you know, that will break the rules and argue, and, you know, all of the kind, you know, we just know that it's just going to go faster than you think. So, you know, but those, you know, and I mean, for example, the United States and France and Canada, they all have speculative and writers in their think tanks to test these things. And then you can make a strategic, you know, plan that affects not just one person, but the whole community. And that is changing the social norms and changing, you know, the social order. And I think, you know, so there's that element of preparedness. But there's also this thing that comes from the other way. So we put out a story that tells us how to behave. So, for example, I mean, I grew up on fairy tales, you know, Grimm tales and Pinocchio and that kind of thing. And, you know, those are really scary stories, you know.
The fairy tales are the original horror stories.
Yeah, if you don't stay on the straight and narrow, girlie, you'll get eaten by a wolf, you know, that kind of stuff. And so that is affecting social behavior, right? Because that's how those stories like that are meant to, you know, set a template for your social behavior. That's, you know, little children should not eat, you know, should not go to the fair and eat ice creams, or they'll turn into, donkeys and will use their skins
Don't
for
take
drums,
candy off the strange old woman in the woods.
Yeah, that is scary. That is scary stuff, right? But
Literature in the world, all the literature in the world that tells you, like, you should behave this way because this is successful, and you still have huge swaths of the population that are just total idiots.
yeah.
Have you never watched Contagion? Have you never watched a
Is
zombie?
that, we're so ahead of the game, aren't we? Because we've read that
Don't
stuff
go down
and
in the
seen that
basement
stuff.
without turning the light on. If the light's broken, don't go down there.
Oh,
Go
yeah.
get a torch.
Yeah, so I think it's just
So-
fascinating, isn't it? That it can actually spread to a whole collective group and not just, obviously you want your fiction to impact one person because that's all you need to impress is one reader, right? But when you think that there's that groundswell when like Eunice said about Stephen Graham Jones, and you've got a lot of people reading that and having a better understanding, and that can change how they treat other people and how they behave in the future, and that's really exciting because it actually makes horror the most powerful movement that we have on earth. It's just super exciting. It's like a superpower.
I called it point of reference because we have the pandemic, and instead of like looking at the pandemic and not having a point of reference going, well, it's a pandemic, what do? We have points of reference. We have Contagion, we have I Am Legend, we have The Walking Dead. We have these points of reference to know how to behave at the time, but there's still a bunch of people who just don't seem to get it.
Or was it somebody said that if the pandemic has proven that if The Walking Dead was real, there would be plenty of people out in the streets refusing to believe that zombies actually exist, and trying to get bitten because it's just going to get the whole thing passed quicker.
Yeah.
Walking up and trying to tear the mask off the zombie.
Yeah.
You can also model good behavior, right? So if we have a hero that has a certain moral code, and then we're also by putting representative, then you saying this is possible for this group or this person, and that's also a means of creating sort of social change. I find it really exciting. Can you tell I'm getting excited?
I think everybody should have characters in mind, and whenever you go to do something, you should like rate yourself. Okay, so I'm like, ask yourself, I'm going to use the Stan. Are you a Nick? Are you a Harold? Randall Flagg.
Don't be Randall Flagg.
Behavior. Again, we got lots of Randall Flaggs here in America. Right. Okay, so pick a character and just rate your behavior, and if it doesn't meet the good guy behavior, don't engage in it. Right?
Tell you what, if we all had an Annie Wilkes, we'd sell a lot more books, right? That will work too. Social influence.
That's excellent. I think a lot of times the characters in the books and the emotional connection that you have to them is extremely powerful in horror because the emotions are so extreme quite often. Yeah. And I think that it allows people to see how it would feel to be in a really bad situation, and not just to see the story or read the story, but actually connect with the character and experience.
It's like practice.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's practice.
Yeah.
And it's mind opening, right? It's mind broadening, I think.
Well, reading in general breeds empathy, because you experience other lives. So, whatever you're reading, you're experiencing something outside of your personal lived experience. And if it's a well-written book, then you get a really good taste of the lived experience of other people, albeit, they may well be fictional, but they're as real as anyone else in context of the book. Mm-hmm. So if reading in general provides empathy, then reading in horror provides empathy for the horrific, if you like. So it's that training. Mm-hmm. It gives us that ability to live in that environment, watch what they do, think about what would you do? Would you be able to do the same? Would you, when you come to a situation like Eunice just said, are you going to be the Nick or the Randall Flagg? You don't necessarily consciously make that decision when a situation happens, but with the subconscious input of reading, you subconsciously do make decisions like that when situations happen. Do I want to be the good guy here or the bad guy? You know, do I want to be the person that helps, or do I want to be the person who makes it worse? By reading these things, we see the outcomes of those decisions in so many different ways in those stories, that even if we don't consciously apply it to life, we do subconsciously become aware of those situations when we are having real life scenarios.
So with regard to that, one of the criticisms of horror and stories where the monster is the protagonist, or you see a person or a bad guy or a monster doing something truly horrific. One of the criticisms is that it gives people ideas, and it actually inspires bad behavior and violence and
Oh,
all of
I
the
think
bad things.
I've read Matthias Klassen's book, Why Horror Seduces, and there's a whole section on there that completely debunks that. So go and read that. And then it basically says recreational horror is actually really healthy, and there's very little evidence that people get ideas and go off and do bad things as a result of reading horror. So it's been largely debunked, I think.
I relate it to the whole idea that people who say horribly racist things when they're drunk, it wasn't the drink that made them say racist things. They are racist, and the drink removed their inhibitions. And they said out loud the stuff they normally keep to themselves. And because I've been really drunk sometimes and didn't suddenly become racist. It's the same for everyone. You don't suddenly become a rapist or a racist or whatever because of alcohol. It's something that you've got inside you, and the alcohol removes the inhibitions. It's the similar bit in some ways. The reverse, if you've got violent tendencies or you've got murderous tendencies or something, you are going to be drawn to stuff that addresses that subject matter to some degree. So, heavy metal music, horror, violent films, or whatever.
Video
you
games.
don't become violent from watching those things. Vast majority of people who watch those things get the benefits we're talking about. People who already have violent issues or problems on that front will be drawn to those things for the same reason, but their problems already exist. Those things don't give them the ideas. So it's not even really a chicken or an egg. It's no surprise that someone who is nihilistic and violent and wants to hurt people is not drawn to Disney. They're drawn to slashers. That makes sense. It wasn't the slashers that made them that way. That was already there. Just the same as it wasn't the drink that made the racist suddenly racist. It was the drink that,
And here's the positive spin on that. Most people who do create horror, right? We know these people, and they tend to be good people, right? The stuff that gets published, I like to think of it's in the hands of good people. So they're not going to really exploit it. I mean, they'll put the spin on it, maybe temper it a little bit. It goes the same with like heavy metal music which I absolutely love heavy metal music, but I don't have any ink on me, piercings or anything else, but I am a metalhead. And when you meet those guys, those are nice people. So I
never feel safer anywhere than at a heavy metal gig. I go to a pop music festival and there are fights, there's attitudes, there's all sorts of shit going on. You go to a heavy metal gig, everyone's friendly. You get in the mosh pit, someone falls down, people will help them up. They're heavy metal fans and horror fans are the nicest people in the world.
True. True.
And it's because it's that catharsis, you see, because they address this stuff. They get that stuff out. So much of heavy metal is about admitting and addressing anger. And so much of it is vaudeville as well. So much of it is theater, in the same way that horror novels or horror movies are a sort of theatrical, creative way of exploring those things. But it is also healthy to address those things and not suppress those things. If you can listen to heavy metal, a lot of people who aren't into heavy metal, for example, they find it strange how listening to heavy metal can calm you down. But if I'm stressed out about stuff and I'm annoyed or angry, I put on heavy metal and I chill out, because it addresses the feelings, right? It addresses those things in the same way that horror addresses the fear. So when you are aware of those I don't like saying negative emotions, because fear and anger are really positive emotions.
Positive, yeah.
There's you know, a righteous anger has achieved more in the world than almost anything else. Fear is what's kept the species alive. It's what you do with those things that can be a problem, but addressing those things and not suppressing them, not pretending that they don't exist, is what is healthy. When you don't face anger, when you don't accept or face fear and internalize those things, then it can come out in strange ways. It can corrupt you or corrupt things around you. So a lot of the time, the whole process of facing those things is what is most healthy about it.
Yeah, that's great, Alan. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So let's talk about your writing in specific. I want to ask each of you, do you choose the theme of your fiction work or its message with the intent of making an impact? Or on another level, have you chosen to write horror because you think it will make an impact, or is it just because you love it? Which is good enough, in my opinion.
Yes, all of the above.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's mean, isn't it? Just yes. That's the short answer. But yeah.
I write horror because I love it, and I write horror because I really truly believe in it. You know, and I study it at an academic level. My master's degree my thesis was in the postmodern Gothic. So I really believe in the genre.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm the same. I absolutely believe in it as a power for good, fundamentally. That's not specifically why I do it. There's a quote. It's stuck right there on the corner of my monitor that I keep there all the time. It's an Octavia E. Butler quote. No entertainment on earth can match a good story compellingly told. That's my driving force. That's always what I remind myself. If I'm stuck on this, what am I doing? Just tell a good story. You want to entertain people with a good story. That's the driving force. And I write the stories that I want to read and that I know other weirdos like me want to read. That's who I'm writing for, fundamentally. And then, because I find dark fiction and horror to be incredibly honest, that's where the story goes. So even if I try to write something that I don't think is especially dark, it tends to veer that way. And it's almost like I'm drawn to writing horror because I can't write a story that doesn't honestly see itself through. Admittedly, if I'm walking along and there's a well-lit street and a dark alley, I'll go down the dark alley because I'm a weirdo and I like the darkness, and that's the attraction for people who, you know, enjoy horror and those sorts of things. But equally, when you then go down the dark alley, if you're going to be honest, you're going to go all the way to the end. You don't sort of stop halfway and turn the light on, or you don't turn around and come back. If you want to follow that honesty of dark fiction, you follow to the end. And so a lot of the time, I think the horror is kind of the net result of trying to tell a good story, trying to tell it well, and trying to tell it honestly, tends to veer to darkness. And even in the darkness, you know, a lot of the time in a lot of my short fiction, it can be a little bit ambiguous or even nihilistic potentially. But when people spend 20 minutes on a short story, you can get away with more. If someone spends 10 hours on a novel, you don't want to leave them absolutely, you know, not completely sort of broken and bleak at the end. So even with horror and with the novel length works, there is usually some sort of resolution. Even if there's a lot of ambiguity in there, there's some sort of success at the end. There's some sort of uplift. The monsters can be beaten, you know, one way or another. But it's that, for me, it's those two things of trying to tell a good story compellingly, to just butcher that quote from Butler, and to tell it honestly. And that's what kind of leads to horror. And it along the way, it's exciting, it's entertaining.
Yeah. Lee, what do you think?
Yeah, I was actually on another panel recently, where I said this, and for me, it is, as Alan says, the most honest place. It's the most honest genre. And you know, I started out writing chick lit, you know, because write what you know, and so I wrote a sort of little chick lit novel about running, because I did a bit of running, and you know, it wasn't what it was fun. I had fun. It was entertaining, you know, and but it wasn't true, and that it wasn't what I really wanted to address. It wasn't helping me to be more resilient. I have, issues with depression and anxiety. I wanted to write about the things that make me frightened. And so to me, I think, and I said this, I think that horror is the only grown-up genre, because eventually you must come to horror. You must come to the dark side to look at the things that matter, to address the things that resonate for us, that frighten us, that concern us about the world. So, and for all the reasons, because they create social change. Because if we're worried about them, let's look at it. Let's do something. If we're worried about climate change, let's do something. So we write about it and we find a way through. And you said exactly that, Alan. You've got to get to the end of the good story, the resolution, and it might be bleak, and we can address that. How am I going to cope with that if it's bleak? And I'm going to read a quote from Dan Raybarts, who my colleague who I co-write with, who says,
Also a Wiley writer.
yes, also a Wiley writer, who says, what is the point of facing down demons if we can't hang their corpses from our battlements so that others can know they can be tamed? And to me, that's kind of the social connection, isn't it? So,
That's
we
nicely
can
put, isn't
do it. Yeah. I know I was specifically talking about horror and mental health, but it is that, isn't it? It's like, what worries you, and how can we all be involved and that's the social change, isn't it? Just if we're all brought together and we can see that, but if this is how I fixed it, this is how I dealt with it, and the next person can, and the next person can, and that's how you create a new world order.
It's interesting to draw, sorry, just to pick up on one thing there, when you mentioned from mental health too, because from that point of view, a lot of the time, a lot of what we deal with in horror is variations on anxiety. And of course, anxiety is the root of so many mental health issues across the board, from depression and obsessive behavior and everything else. Those things are often individually triggered and often a root of some form of anxiety. And again, that's where it can be healthy, in as much as it can show us methods of addressing anxiety, even if it's not necessarily something that can treat anxiety, although there is a case for that.
Writing is anxiety. Come on.
Oh, well, yeah, writing for sure.
As
much reading as well. But it does also put you in a position where you see things reflected back, and you see anxiety from the outside, because so much mental health, so many mental health issues come from being trapped on the inside. And when you can externalize, and when you can see things reflected back from the outside and feel like you're less alone in your anxiety inclusion, or your depression or whatever, it doesn't necessarily fix things, but it puts you in a position where you can go, okay, it's not just me. Yeah. And so much of that first step in addressing a lot of mental health is not just you, and it's not something you've done. It's something that potentially can be helped. And so I think, yeah, a lot of the time, and especially horror, is very good at reflecting that and providing that initial platform.
If you're going to get to the truth, and sometimes the only way you can get to the truth is through the ugly and the metaphoric, and you've got to take it all the way. It is the only genre. Think about it. It's the only genre where you can create the most horrific things that people have to go through to come out on the other side to be a better person. What other genre does that? They don't. Not going to find that chick lit.
It's the genre for grown-ups, right?
Right.
But also behaving like children, because you're writing these stories and having heaps of fun. So what about you, Angel? What do you think?
Well, I always choose a theme for anything I'm writing, and I usually try to keep it to something that that could potentially teach someone something, or show someone something, or reveal something about themselves. Because I think it's important. I think that in our writing, it's really important to understand that we are touching people when they read our books. And I'm not saying that, you're gonna preach to them or anything. I don't believe in that. I just think I think you have to have some intention, some intent behind what you're doing, and not just, oh, I'm just gonna tell a story today. I mean, that's okay, that's fun, that's fine, but it's not something I'm always ready to just do. I usually find myself gravitating towards some sort of message in my work, whether I want
It's
to or not.
interesting. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because you did mention, do we write with a theme in mind? I tend to find more often than not that the theme reveals itself in the writing. I don't start out knowing what I'm writing about, but by the time you get to the end of that first draft and you start looking at it, you're like, oh shit, okay, that's what this is about. And then when I recognize the themes that I'm addressing, okay, you go back and you redraft with those themes in mind, and the whole thing tightens up. Like with Devouring Dark as a novel, it took me a long time in the process of writing that before I realized, oh, okay, this is a book about guilt and grief. And so when I then went back and rewrote it, it's a London crime gangster novel, supernatural assassins, all that stuff. But then when I realized actually the themes I'm exploring here are guilt and grief, good, okay. When I went back and redrafted, everything tightened up because I recognized what it was that was that kind of underlying driving force of that story. And so I often find that that's the case. I don't necessarily go set out with a theme in mind, but I have a story in mind, and I have characters and situations, and that kind of grows and develops. And in the process of that, it's like, okay, that's what this is about. Okay, cool. And then it becomes better. So I think that's an important distinction, because people don't need to have, I don't think, anything more than a good idea in the first instance. A good idea to tell a good story. Write it, have fun, see what happens. And then, as you do edit, subsequently look for those underlying themes. See if you can tease out what it is that's the sort of coherent threads through that story, and then emphasize that to make that story more cohesive and more together. Yeah, I think it works that way. I really, what it boils down to, I really know what the fuck I'm doing while I'm doing it until I've done it, and I look back and go, oh, okay.
Oh, well, it's so clever.
Yeah, and then it comes together. Yeah.
We all need a t-shirt that says that.
That's great. All right, so I have one more question for you. So the world has changed since COVID in the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years. Readers are different. We of course have the whole millennial generation that is very different from the X and Y generation, and very different from boomers. And now we have a whole new generation of young people coming up who are very socially conscious, who have heard nothing but a bunch of news stories about how the world is going to hell, and how there's going to be an apocalypse right around the corner. And, I mean, time and time again, you hear these things. So my question is, do you think that readers today, especially younger readers, and by younger, I mean, in their 20s, 30s, do you think they expect an elevated social commentary in what they read? Or do you think it maybe goes the other direction? They're tired of it.
I was going to say, I think they're savvy. Kids, anything from teenagers through 30s these days, they see through everything. They know when they're being advertised to. They know when they're being played to. I think they're too smart to want to see a social commentary in something, but they will see the inauthenticity in something that doesn't adhere to that kind of social mindset that they have. So in as much as there's no excuse, as we grow older, we can get stuck in mindsets of stuff, but hopefully as we grow, we are paying attention to the world around us and reflecting that. So things that people in their 50s or 60s now, things they might have written about 20 or 30 years ago, they're not going to write about now, or they're going to write about differently, because if they write about it the way they did 30 years ago, they're going to be rightly called up on it.
Yeah.
So I don't know that young people are specifically looking for social commentary, but they're looking for their world to be reflected to them. So if we're honest and paying attention to the world as it is now and what we're doing, and if we write honestly, I think we kind of naturally will provide a social commentary that hopefully will benefit those people. I think if we tried to do that consciously, they'd see through it in a flash.
I think we have a big problem in our society right now, and I think it's a world problem, and that's that whole segment of the population that is buying into, you know, the nationalism and fake news and their version of reality and all of that. And I think it's something, when we're writing, we need to take that into account, that we're not writing from a world where we all share the same reality, where most of us used to share the same reality. We don't exist in that. I'm writing a book right now, and I started writing something like, well, that's crazy, nobody would think that. And I'm like, no, it people are thinking like this, and it is happening right now, and it needs to be incorporated into the story so that it becomes obvious and we're not just ignoring it. And then we need to be careful too, because then these days you'll be accused of being woke, right? What a crazy word that is, right?
How dare you be considerate of other people's feelings?
Exactly. And that's what I'm talking about. The whole segment of population is like, I was reading somebody, they were criticizing the Gilded Age because of the storylines in there. It was like, it was too woke. It's like, it's
Who
just
woke?
What do you think that's about?
Well, there was a whole thing recently going around on Twitter about how this particular subset of people, they're pissed off with the new Star Trek because it was better before it was woke. And it's like, what are you talking about? Star Trek started in the 60s, and the whole point was about social equality. They had the half black and white race. They had the first interracial kiss. Star Trek has been woke for as long as there's been Star Trek, but suddenly people are just going to call it out for doing what it's always done. Same with Doctor Who as well. This thing came up with Doctor Who recently in a similar situation. But why does it have to be so political? It's like, have you never seen John Pertwee's monologues from the 60s? For God's sake, it's like, you know, this is not new, but this pushback against it is kind of new in the social circles that we see. So yeah, I think there's always going to be that group who will accuse you of being woke and will push back on anything that addresses anything from a social point of view. But those are not the people that we're writing for. We're writing for the people who are going to understand and appreciate the story and the themes and whatever else. And if any of those people who are against woke culture do read it and get some tiny skerrick of insight, then great, you know, that's bonus. That's gravy.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's true, I mean, my children are 26 and 23, and my daughter-in-law is 23 too. So that's that age group. And I would say, and my daughter is, you know, gay and disabled. And so they are actually actively going out and looking for those books. So when we say, should we write like that? Should we be, you know, so, and there's a lot more younger people coming into publishing, which I think is fantastic, writing horror, because we're writing from a different place, and what I write might just not resonate for them. And so what I'm thinking is that as readers, they are more discerning. And so they are looking, that, you know, parcels come in the mail, and my daughter's ordered a Kickstarter thing because it's got this in it that she wants to read. So she is looking for that work. And so I don't know, maybe the problem is publishers need to be a little bit more aware of what these people are seeking. You know, they're interested in climate change, just as you say, Angel. They're interested in, you know, conflict and how we resolve them and those kinds of things. And so they're actively looking for works that tell those stories. Now, I don't know. I heard that, you know, the month that the pandemic kind of broke out, you know, Contagion and those movies were just the biggest sellers. You know, people were watching them. So people do seek out what they works that they think will speak to them. It's a bit of that kind of you were talking about that sort of hollow, that sort of wind funnel that we're in, isn't it? But we do, we find comfort in that. I think that there are other people with those views. So it's scary because we have got those, funnels of groups that are thinking very narrowly, but you do want people to be able to access the things that they want to read too. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? It's a tricky one.
Well, for so long, I think anybody who, especially in horror and speculative fiction and stuff, anyone who wasn't a white male had to have their experience through the lens of a white male. And so they would still experience, a lot of sort of social awareness through story and still get a lot of what we've been talking about, but they wouldn't actually see themselves directly in it. It would always be that from that sort of one person removed. So the more people we encourage into publishing who are not white men, and the more characters and situations we include in our stories that don't just reflect that perspective, then the better it is for everyone. Because it's better for the white men who are used to being front and center to realize that you're not the most important person in the room. And it's important for the people who aren't that person to actually see themselves directly reflected, and it's much more powerful for them. And it's not woke or anything else. It's not a deliberate sort of social commentary. It's just actively being inclusive to everybody who's out there and reflecting the world around you. Because if I walk down the street, I don't only see white dudes. So I don't write stories like that. I write stories that reflect the world around me, and I try to treat that with as much sort of respect and correctness as I can, and I get people to read and help out if I'm not sure. But I don't think it's necessarily it's not actively trying to make social commentary, it's just actively trying to be more authentic. And hopefully in the process of that, there is a certain social commentary, because if we are authentic and if we are honest in the stories that we tell, you can't not be making a social commentary.
So there's the question then, who is driving it, the reader or the writer? So for us as writers, we just have to write something that resonates for us and keeps us going for the whole year that it takes to write a novel, or interests us enough, or all of those things. But for are we writing for a reader, or are we just writing for ourselves? So when it's a social change, when you're talking about social change, where does that come from? Is it a push or a pull? And that's a tricky one, isn't it, as writers, to kind of get that balance right.
I think you need to think of it like a bridge, and you come together, reader, writer, and you come together in the middle, and that's where you make your meaning right there.
Yeah, it's a really good way of thinking of it.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, I always write first and foremost the stories I want to read, but I also want to read stories that are as interesting and diverse as the world around me is. So hopefully we can do a good job of that. And that's a good analogy that's like building a bridge to meet the reader on the other side, and hopefully the bridge is complete by the end of the story, and there's not a gap that we've got to jump on.
Falling out.
It's just going nobody's on the other side.
It's a good analogy. I like it.
And then we can talk about things like banned books. If you're talking about social change, sometimes I think that banned books have quite a lot of power in, as soon as I hear a book is banned, I want to know, I want to go read it.
Most librarians will tell you that as soon as a book is banned, they very quickly order in as many copies as they can get, because if you want people to read a book, you ban it.
So in terms of social change, it's interesting because people are also, we're talking about horror, people are also actually very frightened of the power that horror literature or literature has in general for creating change. So for the question of the day is, can horror change the world? Well, clearly people think it can, because they're out there banning books, books about war and real events, and just they're out there banning it. So
if it was harmless, why would you worry about it, right?
Well, that's it. This is the thing. So there is evidence that it is the
Good
thing
trouble.
that can
That's what it
change
is.
the world, So then the other side of it is things like literacy, if people are, how do we tell stories? How do we get those on different media, where can people hear those stories or see those stories, or just sit around the table and tell those stories, those spaces that allow us the safety to tell horror stories, like ghost camp. Everyone started, we went to camp and we went under the blankets and,
around
the
the
torch.
campfire.
They're so fun, but, great inclusive way. So, there's how do you promote that social change? There are lots of different avenues that it's not just, a print book on a page, a print book necessarily. We need to think of other ways. We're creating social change with our horror. How do we do it? How do we connect with more than just one person? Because social is a whole community. So
Right. All right, guys. That was
well,
great.
that went quick.
Yes, we've been here for a little over an hour, or well, almost an hour, I guess. So I want to thank you all very, very much for joining me and having this amazing discussion. That was the coolest. Hopefully the people at Stokercon will enjoy it and will leave comments in our YouTube, on our YouTube. Answer all the questions that we asked and let us know what you think. Again, this is Lee Murray, E.S. McGill, known as Eunice, and Alan Baxter, and I'm Angel Lee McCoy. So I hope you all have a great time at Stokercon. Bye.